They called her fragile, broken, a liability who couldn't be trusted in the field. Irene Hill had survived what most agents never would. But instead of recognition, she received dismissal. Her warnings were ignored, her instincts questioned, her trauma used as evidence of her incompetence. But when a threat emerged that no one else could see, when every protocol failed and every expert was blind, the woman they'd written off became the only person standing between hundreds of lives and catastrophe. This is the story of how being broken doesn't mean being defeated, and how the scars they mock might be exactly what saves them all. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the European Intelligence Coordination Center in Brussels, casting geometric shadows across the polished marble floors. Irene Hill sat in the far corner of the briefing room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She'd arrived early, as she always did, partly out of habit, and partly because arriving early meant fewer eyes on her, fewer whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. At 28, Irene carried herself with a careful precision that most people mistook for fragility. She was slender, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to hold more weight than someone her age should carry. Those who bothered to look closely might have noticed the slight tremor in her left hand, the way she positioned herself with her back to walls, the split-second delay before she responded to sudden noises. But most people at the EICC didn't look that closely. They saw what they wanted to see: a broken agent who'd outlived her usefulness. 18 months ago, Irene had been one of the agency's rising stars. She'd worked deep cover operations across Eastern Europe, her fluency in 6 languages, and her ability to blend into any environment, making her invaluable. She'd been fearless, sharp, the kind of agent that senior operatives pointed to as the future of European intelligence cooperation. Then came the operation in Sarajevo that changed everything. The briefing room began to fill with personnel, their conversations a low buzz of morning routine. Irene recognized most of them, had worked alongside many before Sarajevo. Now they avoided her gaze, treating her like a ghost haunting the hallways of her former life. She'd been back on active duty for 3 months, cleared by the agency psychologists after a year of mandatory leave. But the invisible walls remained. Director Emil Kovac entered precisely at 800 hours, his presence commanding immediate silence. He was a man in his mid-50s, with silver hair and the kind of authoritative bearing that came from 3 decades in intelligence work. Behind him walked his deputy, a stern woman named Petra Volkov, and the agency's head of threat assessment, Dr. Franz Weber, whose academic credentials were matched only by his dismissive attitude toward field operatives. "Good morning," Kovac began, his accent carrying the crisp edges of his Croatian background. "We're here to discuss the upcoming G7 summit in Vienna. Security protocols are being finalized, and I need each department's status update." Irene listened as various department heads presented their reports. Digital security was confident. Physical security had triple-checked all entry points. Intelligence gathering had found no credible threats. Everything was proceeding according to established protocols, a well-oiled machine of bureaucratic efficiency. When it came time for field intelligence reports, Irene raised her hand slightly. Kovac's eyes swept past her initially, then returned with visible reluctance. "Agent Hill, do you have something to contribute?" Irene set down her cold tea and stood, feeling every eye in the room turn toward her. "Sir, I've been reviewing the chatter from our Eastern European networks. There's a pattern that concerns me. Multiple references to the Vienna arrangement across 3 separate communication channels that we've been monitoring. The language is coded, but the timing corresponds exactly with the summit schedule." Dr. Weber leaned back in his chair, his expression one of barely concealed impatience. "Agent Hill, we've analyzed all communications through our threat matrix. Nothing has been flagged as significant. What you're describing sounds like coincidental correlation, not causation. With respect, Dr. Weber, I've worked these networks for years. I know how they communicate, how they think. This isn't coincidental. The phrasing, the timing, even the choice of channels it all suggests. Coordinated planning. Petra Volkov consulted her tablet, her lips pressed into a thin line. Agent Hill, your observations have been noted in your field reports. However, our analytical team, which includes specialists in pattern recognition and threat assessment, has found no substantive evidence to support your concerns. We can't adjust our security protocols based on intuition. The word intuition landed like a slap. It was code Irene knew for your judgment can't be trusted anymore. This isn't intuition, Irene insisted, her voice remaining steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. I've documented specific communications, traced connections between known operatives, and identified a timeline that perfectly aligns with vulnerable transition periods during the summit. I'm requesting permission to conduct deeper surveillance on 3 specific individuals who've appeared repeatedly in these communications. Director Kovac exchanged glances with Weber and Volkov, a silent conversation passing between them. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured but firm. Agent Hill, I appreciate your diligence. However, we have limited resources and cannot allocate surveillance teams based on preliminary hunches. If you develop concrete evidence, something that meets our evidentiary threshold for actionable intelligence, bring it to Deputy Volkov's attention. For now, we'll proceed with our current security framework. Irene remained standing for a moment longer, her mind racing through the dozens of connections she'd identified. The patterns that seemed so clear to her but apparently invisible to everyone else. She could see it in their faces. The polite dismissal. The underlying concern about her stability. To them, she wasn't a veteran field agent with valuable insights. She was a trauma victim seeing threats and shadows. She sat down slowly, her folder of documented evidence feeling heavy in her lap. Around her, the briefing continued, moving on to logistics and scheduling as if her concerns had never been raised. Someone mentioned coffee arrangements for the visiting dignitaries, and quiet laughter rippled through the room. As the meeting concluded and personnel began filing out, Dr. Weber paused near Irene's seat. His voice was low, meant to sound kind, but landing as condescending. Agent Hill, perhaps you should consider that you might be projecting your past experiences onto current situations. It's a common response to trauma. There's no shame in it. Irene looked up at him, her expression carefully neutral. And perhaps, Dr. Weber, you should consider that surviving an attack doesn't make someone paranoid. Sometimes it just makes them better at seeing what's actually there. Weber's smile never reached his eyes. The difference between paranoia and preparedness is evidence, Agent Hill. When you have some, we'll listen. He walked away, leaving Irene alone in the emptying briefing room. Through the tall windows, she could see the Brussels skyline, peaceful and orderly under the clear morning sun. Somewhere in that peaceful city, in those orderly streets, people were planning something. She could feel it, could see the threads connecting in ways that her analytical training and her hard-won experience told her were significant. But feeling it and proving it were 2 different things. And in an agency that had already decided she was broken, proving anything would require more than evidence. It would require a miracle. Irene gathered her materials and headed back to her small office, a converted storage room that served as a pointed reminder of her diminished status. The walls were bare except for a map of Eastern Europe, covered in colored pins and connecting strings that represented the network she'd been tracking. To anyone else, it probably looked like the obsessive work of someone unraveling. To Irene, it was a picture slowly coming into focus, a threat taking shape that everyone else refused to see. She had 10 days until the Vienna summit. 10 days to prove she wasn't paranoid, wasn't broken, wasn't projecting. 10 days to convince people who'd already made up their minds about her that the patterns she saw were real. 10 days to prevent something terrible from happening while everyone around her insisted there was nothing to prevent. Irene pinned another connection to her map and stepped back, studying the web of evidence that made perfect sense to her and apparently no sense to anyone else. The morning sun continued to shine through her small window. Indifferent to the storm she could feel building on the horizon. The converted storage room that served as Irene's office had become her sanctuary and her prison. It was barely large enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, and the wall-mounted map that had become the focus of her existence. The overhead fluorescent light hummed with an irregular frequency that most people would find maddening, but Irene had learned to tune it out, just as she'd learned to tune out the pitying glances and whispered conversations that followed her through the EICC's corridors. She'd spent the afternoon since the morning briefing doing what she did best, digging deeper. The official intelligence databases had given her nothing new, their algorithms and threat matrices blind to the patterns she recognized. So she'd turned to the gray areas, the unofficial networks of contacts and informants she'd cultivated during her years in the field, people who operated in the spaces between official channels, where the real information often flowed. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a contact in Prague, a former asset named Joseph who owed her his life from an extraction operation 3 years ago. His message was brief but significant. "Your Vienna concern has substance. Heard whispers about the conductor coordinating something during the music festival. People are scared to talk. Be careful." The music festival. The Vienna summit coincided with the city's annual International Music Festival, which meant massive crowds, complex logistics, and a security nightmare that would stretch resources thin. It was exactly the kind of environment where something catastrophic could hide in plain sight. Irene added the information to her growing file, cross-referencing it with the communications she'd already flagged. The pieces were coming together, but not fast enough. She needed something concrete, something that would force Kovac and his team to take her seriously. A knock on her door frame startled her, her hand instinctively moving toward the desk drawer where she kept her service weapon before she caught herself. The reaction was automatic, a remnant of Sarajevo that she'd never quite managed to suppress. "Easy, Hill. Just me." Agent Luca Rossi stood in the doorway, a paper coffee cup in each hand and an expression of cautious friendliness on his face. Luca was one of the few people in the agency who still treated her like a colleague rather than a cautionary tale. They'd gone through training together 6 years ago, had worked several operations side by side before Sarajevo changed everything. "Thought you might need this," he said, extending one of the cups. "You looked like you could use backup in that briefing this morning." Irene accepted the coffee, genuinely grateful. "Thanks, Luca, though I'm not sure caffeine is going to solve my credibility problem." Luca stepped into the small office, his eyes scanning the map covered in pins and strings. He'd seen it before, had even helped her add some connections a few weeks ago. But his expression suggested he was seeing it differently now, perhaps wondering if everyone else was right about her obsession. "That's quite a web you've got there," he said carefully. "You really think something's happening in Vienna?" "I don't think, Luca. I know. The question is whether I can prove it before it's too late." She gestured to the map. "Look at this. 3 separate cells, each with historical ties to different extremist organizations, suddenly showing coordinated activity for the first time. Communications using coded language that references the summit timing. Financial movements that suggest operational funding. And now my contact in Prague mentions the conductor and the music festival." Luca studied the map, his analytical mind working through the connections. "I can see why you're concerned, but you know how Weber and Volkov operate. They need hard evidence, something that fits their models and matrices. This," he gestured at the map, "this looks like connect the dots based on intuition." "Field experience isn't intuition," Irene said, hearing the edge creep into her voice. "I've run operations in every city marked on this map. I know these networks, know how they operate. The fact that their algorithms can't see the pattern doesn't mean the pattern isn't there." Luca held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not saying you're wrong, Irene. I'm saying you need to play their game if you want them to listen. Give them something concrete, something their systems can verify and validate. And if there isn't time for that, if by the time I have the kind of evidence they'll accept, it's too late to stop whatever's being planned." The question hung in the air between them. Luca took a sip of his coffee, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Then you do what you can with the resources you have. But you can't go rogue, Irene. Not after. Not after last time. Last time. The words were carefully chosen, a reference to Sarajevo without explicitly naming it. Luka was one of the few people who knew the full story of what had happened, one of the even fewer who'd never blamed her for the outcome. 18 months ago, Irene had been running a surveillance operation targeting a weapons trafficking network in Sarajevo. The operation had been routine, textbook even, until she'd noticed something off about one of their local assets. A man named Dmitri who'd been providing them with information for months. Small things at first. Inconsistencies in his reports, changes in his behavior, a nervousness that seemed to intensify rather than diminish as the operation progressed. She'd flagged her concerns to her handler, a senior agent named Victor Hammond, who'd dismissed her worries as operational stress. When she'd pressed harder, Hammond had made it clear that questioning a proven asset without evidence was a career-limiting move. So, Irene had done what she was trained to do. She'd followed orders and suppressed her instincts. 3 days later, Dmitri had led them into an ambush. The trafficking network they'd been investigating had known about the surveillance all along, had been feeding them carefully curated information while planning their trap. The explosion that followed had killed 2 agents, injured 4 others, and left Irene trapped in a collapsed building for 8 hours with a dead colleague's body and the screaming certainty that she'd seen it coming and failed to stop it. The physical injuries had healed. The psychological ones had not. And now, whenever she raised concerns based on pattern recognition and field instinct, she could see people wondering if she was seeing real threats or ghosts of Sarajevo. "This isn't like last time," Irene said quietly. "I'm not questioning a proven asset. I'm identifying a coordinated threat that everyone is choosing to ignore because it doesn't fit their comfortable models." "I believe you," Luka said, and the sincerity in his voice was like a lifeline. "But belief isn't enough in this building. You need proof. What's your next move?" Irene turned back to her map, her mind already working through possibilities. "I need to identify who the conductor is. If someone's coordinating multiple cells, there has to be a control point. Someone making decisions and communicating orders. Find the conductor, and I can prove the network exists. That's a significant surveillance operation, Irene. You'll need authorization, resources, probably a team, which Kovac won't give me without evidence I can't get without those resources." She smiled bitterly. "It's a perfect catch-22. Luka was quiet for a moment, then asked carefully, "What if you're wrong? What if Weber and Volkov are right, and you're seeing patterns where there's only noise?" It was a fair question, one that Irene had asked herself countless times in the dark hours of the morning. The trauma of Sarajevo had left scars, had changed how she processed threat information, made her hypervigilant in ways that sometimes bordered on paranoid. She knew this, had discussed it extensively with the agency psychologists who'd eventually cleared her for return to duty. But she also knew the difference between trauma-driven paranoia and legitimate pattern recognition. She'd spent her entire adult life in intelligence work, had developed instincts that had saved lives and prevented attacks. Those instincts hadn't disappeared in Sarajevo. If anything, they'd been honed by the bitter lesson of ignoring them. Then, hundreds of diplomats will have a safe summit. Vienna will host a successful music festival. And I'll have wasted 10 days chasing shadows, Irene replied. "I can live with being wrong, Luka. What I can't live with is being right and doing nothing because everyone dismissed me as the broken agent who can't be trusted." Luka nodded slowly, seeming to come to some decision. "All right. I can't give you official resources, but I can help you run some background checks, quietly. Give me the names you want researched, and I'll see what I can dig up through unofficial channels. If there's something there, maybe we can build a case that even Weber can't ignore." Relief flooded through Irene, the first she'd felt since the morning briefing. Having even one ally made the impossible feel merely improbable. "Thank you, Luka. Seriously, don't thank me yet. If we're wrong about this, we're both probably looking at reassignment to some filing office in a basement somewhere." He finished his coffee and stood to leave. Send me the names. I'll start running them tonight." After Luca left, Irene returned to her map, her mind working faster now that she had at least minimal support. The conductor. Finding that person was the key to everything. Someone coordinating multiple cells across Eastern Europe. Someone with the resources and authority to plan something during a high-profile summit. Her phone buzzed again. Another encrypted message, this time from a different contact. The message was longer, more detailed, and as Irene read it, her blood turned cold. Her contact had intercepted a fragment of communication, referencing the broken bridge, which was known code in certain networks for an assassination operation. The Vienna Summit. The music festival. Multiple coordinated cells. And now, assassination. Irene pulled up the summit schedule on her computer, cross-referencing it with the music festival events. There would be a gala concert on the fourth night of the summit, attended by all the visiting heads of state and diplomatic delegations. Maximum visibility, maximum impact, maximum catastrophe. She had 6 days to prove what she knew. 6 days to convince people who'd already written her off that their comfortable certainty was about to get people killed. 6 days to be right in a way that couldn't be ignored. The afternoon sun streamed through her small window, and somewhere in the building, she could hear laughter from the cafeteria. Normal people having normal conversations, unaware that someone they considered broken and unreliable might be the only person standing between them and disaster. Irene opened her secure laptop and began drafting a detailed intelligence report, documenting every connection, every communication intercept, every pattern she'd identified. It would be ignored, she knew, filed away as more evidence of her obsessive paranoia. But when the truth came out, when the threat materialized, and people started asking why no one saw it coming, at least there would be a record that someone had seen it, had warned them, had tried. Being right wouldn't save her career if she was ignored. But being right might save lives. And after Sarajevo, that was all that mattered. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The next morning brought rain to Brussels, a cold drizzle that matched Irene's mood as she made her way through the EICC's security checkpoints. She'd spent most of the night cross-referencing data, following digital breadcrumbs across encrypted networks, building a case that she hoped would be impossible to dismiss. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but her mind was sharp, focused by the clarity that came from knowing she was right, even if no one else could see it yet. Luca had sent her a message at 3 in the morning with preliminary background checks on the names she'd flagged. 2 of them had recently traveled to Vienna, ostensibly for business meetings that checked out on the surface, but felt wrong to someone who understood how cover stories were constructed. The third name, a man called Alexei Volkov, no relation to Deputy Director Petra Volkov, had disappeared from all tracking systems 2 weeks ago, which in intelligence terms was either death or deep operational cover. Irene suspected the latter. She'd requested a meeting with Deputy Director Volkov through official channels, knowing it would likely be denied but needing to create a paper trail. To her surprise, Volkov's assistant had granted her 15 minutes at 10:00 hours. It wasn't much time, but it was an opportunity. The morning briefing passed in a blur of routine updates and administrative details. Director Kovac mentioned the Vienna preparations only briefly, expressing confidence in the security arrangements and praising the coordination between various agencies. No one mentioned threats because, officially, there were none worth discussing. Irene watched Dr. Weber during the briefing, studying his body language and the casual certainty with which he dismissed any suggestion that their analytical models might have blind spots. Weber represented everything she'd come to resent about modern intelligence work: the over-reliance on algorithms and data matrices, the dismissal of human intuition and field experience, the comfortable arrogance of people who'd never had to make split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. At precisely 10:00 hours, Irene knocked on Deputy Director Volkov's door. The office was larger than Kovac's, but more austere, decorated with commendations and photographs from various international security conferences. Volkov sat behind a desk that looked like it had never seen clutter, every document filed, every surface organized with military precision. "Agent Hill," Volkov said without preamble. "You have 15 minutes. Make it count." Irene set her file folder on the desk and opened it to reveal the most compelling evidence she'd compiled. "Ma'am, I've identified a coordinated network planning an operation during the Vienna summit. I have communication intercepts, travel pattern analysis, and financial transaction records that all point to something significant being organized." Volkov examined the documents with the careful attention of someone trained to spot deception. Her expression remained neutral, revealing nothing. "These communication intercepts, have they been verified through our standard protocols?" "No, ma'am. They came through informal channels, contacts I've developed over years of field work. The information is reliable, but it won't pass through Weber's analytical framework because it doesn't originate from approved sources." "Then it's not intelligence, Agent Hill. It's rumor and speculation." Volkov pushed the folder back across the desk. "Our security protocols for Vienna are based on verified, actionable intelligence processed through established analytical frameworks. We can't restructure our entire operation based on unverified information from irregular sources. With respect, Deputy Director, not everything that matters can be verified through official channels. Sometimes the most important intelligence comes from sources that algorithms can't process." Volkov's eyes hardened. "Agent Hill, I'm going to be direct with you because I believe you deserve honesty. Your service record before Sarajevo was exemplary. What happened there was tragic, and no one blames you for the trauma you experienced. But that trauma has affected your judgment. You're seeing threats where extensive analysis finds none. You're questioning methodologies that have successfully protected countless operations. Or those methodologies have blind spots that haven't been exploited yet." Irene countered, feeling her composure start to crack. "Just because your models haven't failed before doesn't mean they can't fail now. Every system has theoretical vulnerabilities, Agent Hill. That doesn't mean we abandon proven procedures for hunches." Volkov's tone softened slightly, which somehow made it worse. "I know you want to prove yourself after Sarajevo. I understand the need to feel competent again after experiencing something that shook your confidence. But manufacturing threats isn't the way to rebuild your reputation." The words landed like physical blows. Manufacturing threats. As if her months of careful analysis, her years of field experience, her documented evidence were all just desperate attempts to feel relevant again. "I'm not manufacturing anything," Irene said, her voice tight. "I'm identifying a real threat that everyone is choosing to ignore because it's easier to believe I'm broken than to acknowledge your systems might be incomplete." Volkov stood, signaling the meeting was over. "Agent Hill, I'm going to recommend that you take some time off. The stress of trying to return to full duty so quickly after trauma is clearly affecting you. A few weeks of rest might give you perspective." "I don't need perspective. I need someone to listen before people die. This meeting is concluded." Volkov's voice carried the finality of command. "I'll have your leave papers processed by end of day." Irene gathered her rejected evidence and left the office, her hands shaking with suppressed rage and frustration. In the corridor outside, she saw Weber approaching, his expression suggesting he'd been briefed on the meeting's outcome. "Agent Hill," he said with false sympathy. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is acknowledge our limitations. There's no shame in needing more time to heal." Irene looked at him, at his comfortable certainty and professional condescension, and felt something harden inside her. They weren't going to listen. No matter what evidence she brought, no matter how clear the patterns became, they'd already decided she was the problem, which meant she had 5 days to stop a catastrophe that officially didn't exist, using resources she officially didn't have, while being officially relieved of duty. The rain continued outside, and Irene walked toward her small office, already planning her next move. If the system wouldn't help her, she'd work outside it. She'd been operating in gray areas her entire career. Now she'd just be doing it without permission. Irene didn't go home after her meeting with Volkov. Instead, she returned to her office and began systematically copying files to encrypted drives, downloading everything she'd need to continue her investigation independently. The leave papers would be processed by evening, and with them would come the revocation of her building access and system credentials. She had maybe 6 hours to gather everything that might help her stop what was coming. Luka found her at noon, his face grave as he closed the office door behind him. "I heard about Volkov. I'm sorry, Irene. I tried to put in a good word, but it's fine," Irene interrupted, not looking up from her work. "I expected it. They've decided I'm the problem, so removing me is their solution. Easier than questioning whether their perfect systems might have flaws." Luka watched her work for a moment before speaking carefully. "What are you planning?" "To do my job, whether they want me to or not." She finished copying a file and moved to the next. "Someone has to. Irene, if you continue investigating after being placed on leave, that's not just insubordination. That could be criminal charges, especially if you're accessing classified information without authorization. Then I better make sure I'm right." She finally looked at him, seeing the concern and conflict in his expression. "Luka, I need you to do something for me. I need you to keep monitoring those names we discussed. If anything changes, if any of them moves or communicates, I need to know immediately. You're asking me to feed information to someone on unauthorized leave. That's my career, Irene. I know. And I wouldn't ask if I wasn't certain that people are going to die if we do nothing." She handed him a piece of paper with an encrypted contact number. "Use this. It's secure and can't be traced back to you. If you decide you can't help, I understand. But please, at least keep your eyes open. If something happens in Vienna, if I'm right about this, I need someone inside who knows the truth." Luka took the paper, staring at it as if it were a weapon. "You're really convinced this is happening? I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He pocketed the paper and nodded slowly. "All right. I'll watch. But Irene, if this goes wrong, if you're chasing something that isn't there, then I'll accept the consequences. But Luka, promise me something. If I'm right, if something happens and I'm not there to stop it, promise me you'll tell people I tried to warn them. That there was evidence, and it was ignored. That's morbid as hell. That's realistic." She managed a tired smile. "Now get out of here before someone sees you helping the paranoid agent on her way out." After Luka left, Irene spent the remaining hours organizing her materials and planning her next steps. She couldn't access agency resources officially, but she had contacts, favors owed, and enough money saved to fund an independent operation for at least a few weeks. More importantly, she had something none of the analysts sitting in their comfortable offices had: first-hand knowledge of how these networks operated, what motivated them, and how they thought. The leave papers arrived at 1600 hours, delivered by an uncomfortable junior administrator who couldn't meet her eyes. Irene signed them without protest, collected her personal belongings, and surrendered her building credentials. The weight of the encrypted drives in her bag felt like stolen futures, evidence that might save lives if she could just prove what she knew. Walking out of the EICC building felt surreal, like crossing a threshold into exile. The rain had stopped, leaving Brussels gleaming and clean under breaking clouds. Irene stood on the steps for a moment, looking back at the building that had been her professional home for 6 years, wondering if she'd ever walk through those doors again with her reputation intact. Her phone buzzed with a message from Joseph in Prague. "The conductor is moving. Something's happening soon. Be careful." Irene flagged down a taxi and gave the driver an address in the city's diplomatic quarter. If the agency wouldn't investigate the conductor, she'd do it herself. She had 4 days until the Vienna summit began. 4 days to identify who was coordinating this operation and what they were planning. The taxi dropped her at a small cafe that served as a known meeting point for intelligence operatives from various agencies. It was neutral ground, a place where information was traded and deals were made outside official channels. Irene ordered coffee and waited, knowing that word of her leave would spread quickly through the informal networks and that certain people would be curious about what she did next. She didn't have to wait long. A man in his 60s, well-dressed and carrying the bearing of someone important, sat down across from her without asking permission. Irene recognized him as Gregor Stanislaw, a former Polish intelligence officer who now operated as a freelance consultant, which was polite terminology for a broker of sensitive information. "Agent Hill," he said in accented English. "I hear you've been relieved of your duties. My condolences." Word travels fast. In our world, it always does. I also hear you've been asking questions about Vienna, about certain networks becoming active. Dangerous questions from someone who no longer has official protection. Irene met his gaze steadily. "I'm still asking them. Do you have answers?" Gregor smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Perhaps. But information has value, especially information that certain agencies would prefer remained hidden. What are you offering in exchange?" This was the game, the dance of intelligence work, where everything was transaction and nothing was free. Irene had anticipated this moment, had prepared for it. "I have information about network operations across Eastern Europe, details that aren't in any official database because they came from personal contacts and field observations. Details that someone like you could monetize with the right buyers." Tempting, but also risky, accepting stolen intelligence from a disgraced agent. "I'm not disgraced. I'm dismissed. There's a difference." Irene leaned forward slightly. "And I'm offering more than information. I'm offering the truth about what's being planned for Vienna. When it happens, when the agencies scramble to figure out how they missed it, the person who actually knows the truth will be very valuable indeed." Gregor considered this, his fingers drumming softly on the table. "You're very confident that something is being planned." "I'm certain of it. And if you're wrong, then you've lost nothing but a few hours of conversation. But if I'm right, you'll have advanced knowledge of a major incident before any official agency. That has to be worth something." After a long moment, Gregor nodded. "Very well, Agent Hill. I'll tell you what I know. But understand that once I do, you'll be operating in very dangerous territory. The networks you're investigating don't take kindly to people who ask too many questions." "I survived Sarajevo," Irene said quietly. "I can survive this." Sarajevo was supposed to be a lesson about the price of ignoring warnings. Gregor replied, "Let's hope Vienna doesn't become another one." The information Gregor provided was both more and less than Irene had hoped for. He confirmed that something was indeed being coordinated for Vienna, involving multiple cells that had historically operated independently. The conductor existed, was real, was someone with significant resources and connections. But Gregor didn't know the conductor's identity, only that the operation was called Requiem, and that it involved the music festival gala that would be attended by every major diplomatic figure at the summit. Irene spent that evening in a rented apartment, far from her usual residence, spreading out her materials and building a timeline. Requiem, the name itself was telling, a musical term for a mass for the dead, suggesting that whoever planned this had a sense of drama to match their ambition. The choice of the gala made tactical sense. Maximum impact, maximum media coverage, maximum casualties among global leadership. Her phone rang at 2200 hours. Luca's voice was tense when she answered. "One of your flagged names just booked travel to Vienna. Alexei Volkov, the one who'd gone dark. He'll be there tomorrow. Can you track where he's staying?" "I shouldn't even be telling you this much, Irene. But yes, I have an address. A private residence in Vienna's Old Quarter, registered to a shell company with ties to the networks you've been tracking." He paused. "This is real, isn't it? Something's actually happening." "Yes, and we have 3 days to stop it." Irene was already pulling up travel options on her laptop. "Luca, I need you to do something for me inside the agency. I need you to request additional security reviews for the gala, focusing on the music festival crowd control. Make it seem like routine due diligence, Nothing that would trigger suspicion. And if they ask why I'm suddenly concerned about crowd control, tell them you've been reviewing historical incidents and want to ensure all contingencies are covered. They love that kind of bureaucratic thoroughness. Irene booked a train ticket to Vienna, leaving at 600 hours. If I can identify the conductor and document the network before the summit begins, maybe I can bring evidence that even Weber can't ignore. And if you can't? If this Requiem operation is already too far along to stop? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Irene had considered this scenario extensively during her sleepless nights. If she couldn't stop the operation through official channels, if she couldn't convince the agency to act, you're so certain. After Sarajevo, after being dismissed, after everything that's happened, you're still absolutely convinced you're right. That level of certainty can be dangerous. So can the kind of doubt that paralyzes people into inaction. Irene stood, ready to begin. 36 hours, Heinrich. Let's not waste them questioning whether I'm stable enough to save lives. Adler provided her with a secure apartment near the embassy and access to surveillance equipment that Brussels had never trusted her with. As she set up her operation, Irene felt the familiar focus that came from having a clear mission and the tools to execute it. The conductor was out there, coordinating Requiem, confident that the dismissed agent wouldn't be taken seriously. That confidence was about to become their fatal mistake. The apartment Adler provided was compact but well-equipped, with secure communications and surveillance technology that made Irene's previous efforts look primitive by comparison. She spent the first hour familiarizing herself with the systems, then began the careful process of re-establishing surveillance on the building where Volkov and Kozlov were coordinating operations. The enhanced equipment allowed her to intercept digital communications and monitor multiple frequencies simultaneously. Within 3 hours, she'd identified an encrypted network being used by the Requiem operatives, and while she couldn't break the encryption immediately, the traffic patterns themselves told a story. Increased communication, multiple coordination points, all building toward a final synchronization that would happen tomorrow night. Adler checked in periodically, bringing food and reviewing her findings with the careful attention of someone who understood that lives depended on getting this right. He'd sent formal but carefully worded inquiries to Austrian security about the gala arrangements, planting seeds of concern without revealing the full extent of Irene's investigation. "They're resistant," he reported during his evening visit. "Security is already complex, and they don't want last-minute changes based on what they're calling unsubstantiated concerns from a dismissed agent. I didn't mention you by name, but word travels fast in intelligence circles. So we need the conductor's identity even more urgently." Irene pulled up her analysis of the communication patterns. "Look at this. There's one node that all other communications route through, a central coordination point. That has to be the conductor's location. Can you trace it?" "I'm working on it. The encryption is sophisticated, but they're maintaining operational security by physically moving the coordination point every few hours. Smart, but it creates patterns. If I can predict the next location, I can get physical confirmation of who's operating it." Adler studied her work with growing respect. "You're good at this. Brussels was foolish to sideline you. Brussels was scared of me, scared that I might be right, scared that their systems failed, scared that acknowledging my warnings meant acknowledging their own blindness." Irene adjusted her surveillance feeds. Fear makes people do stupid things, like dismissing evidence because it comes from someone they've labeled as broken. "Are you broken, Agent Hill?" The question was direct, almost clinical. Irene appreciated the honesty. "Yes. Sarajevo broke something in me that therapy and time haven't fully repaired. I see threats more clearly now, but I also see them everywhere. The difference is that I've learned to distinguish between trauma-driven paranoia and legitimate pattern recognition. This," she gestured at her screens, "is legitimate. Requiem is real." "I believe you," Adler said simply. "For what it's worth, I think your trauma makes you better at this work, not worse. You understand consequences in ways that people like Weber never will." Before Irene could respond, One of her surveillance systems alerted her to movement at the target building. Multiple individuals were arriving simultaneously, more than she'd seen at any previous meeting. She began recording, capturing faces and license plates, documenting everything. "This is it," she said, her pulse quickening. "This is the final coordination meeting before Requiem launches. The conductor has to be here." She and Adler watched as various operatives entered the building over the next hour. Volkov and Kozlov were there, along with several others Irene had identified in her previous surveillance. But there was one arrival that made her breath catch. A woman in her 50s, elegant and composed, carrying herself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Computer, run facial recognition on the woman entering at timestamp 2147. Irene commanded. The system processed the image, searching databases across multiple intelligence agencies. The match appeared on screen, and Irene felt her blood run cold. Dr. Margareta Fischer, retired Austrian intelligence officer, current security consultant to various European agencies, and most relevantly, one of the people who'd been consulted on the Vienna summit security protocols. "The conductor has been inside the security planning all along," Irene said, her mind racing through implications. "She helped design the very systems she's planning to exploit. That's why our threat analysis missed everything." Fischer knew exactly what the algorithms were looking for, and structured Requiem to avoid triggering them. Adler was already on his phone, speaking rapid German to someone at Austrian security. Irene continued documenting the meeting, capturing every face, every vehicle, building an indisputable record of the conspiracy. This was the proof she needed, the evidence that even Weber couldn't dismiss. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When the participants began departing, Irene noticed they were splitting up, heading in different directions with purposeful coordination. The final phase of Requiem was beginning, operatives moving into position for tomorrow night's attack. "We need to move now," Irene told Adler as he finished his call. "If we wait until tomorrow, they'll be too dispersed to stop. We need to hit them tonight while they're still coordinated." Austrian security is assembling a response team, but they want confirmation that Fischer is actually involved in a conspiracy rather than attending a legitimate meeting. Adler looked frustrated. They're reluctant to arrest a respected former intelligence officer based on surveillance alone. "Then I'll get them more." Irene was already gathering equipment, preparing for what came next. "I'm going to follow Fischer, document where she goes and what she does. If she's meeting with operatives, preparing equipment, doing anything that confirms her role in Requiem, that's the confirmation they need. That's extremely dangerous. If Fischer realizes she's being followed, she won't. I've been doing this for years, Heinrich. I know how to tail a target without being detected." Irene checked her weapon, ensuring it was loaded and ready. "Besides, what choice do we have? Wait for Austrian bureaucracy to overcome its reluctance while Requiem proceeds on schedule." Adler clearly wanted to argue, but couldn't deny the logic. "Take this," he said, handing her a tracker device. "Keep it on you at all times. If something goes wrong, if you need extraction, press the button and we'll come immediately." Irene pocketed the device and headed for the door. "If I'm not back in 6 hours, assume Fischer found me and proceed with what evidence we have. Don't wait for me if it means letting Requiem happen." "Agent Hill," Adler called as she reached the door. "What you're doing, going after Fischer alone, it's either very brave or very reckless. I'm not sure which. In my experience, they're usually the same thing." Irene managed a tight smile. "But I didn't survive Sarajevo just to watch another catastrophe unfold, because people were too cautious to act. Fischer is the conductor, and I'm going to prove it." She left the apartment and disappeared into Vienna's night streets. Following the digital trail, Fischer's vehicle was leaving on the tracking system Adler had provided. Somewhere ahead, the conductor was moving into position for the final phase of an operation that had been months in planning. Irene had hours to document enough evidence to stop it. The city lights blurred past as she moved through shadows, every instinct honed by years of fieldwork telling her that she was close to the truth. close to vindication, close to proving that being broken didn't mean being wrong, but also close to danger that could end everything if she made even one mistake. Fisher's vehicle led Irene to Vienna's industrial district, an area of warehouses and logistics facilities that would be largely deserted at this hour. Irene maintained careful distance, using traffic and terrain to mask her pursuit while keeping the tracker signal strong. This was dangerous ground for surveillance, with few crowds to blend into and plenty of isolated spaces where confrontation would be deadly. The vehicle stopped at a warehouse near the Donau Canal, a nondescript building that looked like a dozen others in the area. Irene parked 3 blocks away and approached on foot, using darkness and industrial equipment for cover. Through her binoculars, she could see Fisher entering the warehouse accompanied by 2 men Irene recognized from the earlier meeting. The warehouse's high windows were grimy but not completely opaque. Irene found a position that gave her a partial view inside and began documenting everything with a high-resolution camera. What she saw confirmed her worst fears and vindicated every instinct that had driven her investigation. The warehouse interior was filled with equipment. Sound systems, lighting rigs, instrument cases, all the materiel that would be delivered to the gala venue tomorrow as part of the music festival preparations. But Irene could see modifications, subtle alterations that transformed innocent equipment into something far more sinister. Cases that were slightly too heavy, wiring that served no musical purpose, components that didn't belong in concert equipment, explosives. The realization hit like ice water. Requiem wasn't just an assassination. It was a massive bombing disguised as entertainment equipment, positioned throughout the gala venue where it would maximize casualties among the diplomatic attendees and civilian crowd. Fisher had used her security consulting role to ensure the equipment passed inspection, had designed the entire operation to exploit the trust placed in festival preparations. Irene photographed everything, capturing clear images of Fisher directing the loading process, of operatives checking detonators, of the entire conspiracy laid out in undeniable detail. This was the proof Adler needed, the evidence that would force action regardless of any lingering doubts about Irene's credibility. She was preparing to withdraw when her phone vibrated with an urgent message from Adler. Austrian security moving on your location. Fisher's people detected surveillance and alerted her. Get out now. Irene cursed and began backing away from her observation post, but she'd barely moved 10 feet when floodlights snapped on, illuminating the area around the warehouse. She'd been made. Her position compromised by security measures she hadn't detected. Agent Hill, Fisher's voice called out, amplified by speakers. I know you're out there. I know what you've seen. You have 2 choices. Surrender your evidence and walk away, or die in this industrial park and become another tragic casualty of Vienna's crime problems. You have 60 seconds to decide. Irene's mind raced through options. She could run, but Fisher's people would be positioned to intercept any escape route. She could fight, but she was outnumbered and outgunned. Or she could do what she'd done in Sarajevo. Trust that her evidence was more important than her survival. She activated the emergency upload function on her camera, sending everything to Adler's secure server. Then she transmitted her location through the tracker device, knowing Austrian security was already en route but might not arrive in time. Finally, she stood up from her cover and walked toward the warehouse with her hands visible. I'm unarmed and approaching, she called out. Let's talk, Dr. Fisher. Fisher emerged from the warehouse, flanked by armed operatives. In the harsh floodlights, she looked every bit the conductor of a symphony of destruction, composed and confident. Agent Hill, you've been quite persistent. I have to admire your dedication, even if it's fundamentally misguided. Misguided? You're planning to murder hundreds of people. I'm planning to remind Europe that security built on complacency and bureaucratic certainty is no security at all. Fisher's tone was almost professorial. Your own agency proved my point perfectly. You identified the threat, provided evidence, and were dismissed because you didn't fit their comfortable narratives. Requiem succeeds because people like Weber trust systems more than soldiers. And people die because people like you exploit that trust. Irene kept her hands visible but her body language alert. It's over. Fisher. I've documented everything. Sent it all to German intelligence and Austrian security. They're on their way here right now. Fisher smiled coldly. Are they? Or is that a bluff from an agent with a documented history of paranoid delusions? Even if you transmitted evidence, how long before bureaucratic procedures and threat assessments delay any actual response? Long enough for Requiem to proceed on schedule? Certainly. The words stung because they contained truth. Even with clear evidence, the same institutional inertia that had dismissed Irene's warnings might slow the response. But she also heard something else in Fisher's voice. Uncertainty. The first crack in the conductor's composed certainty. You're wrong, Irene said quietly. About me, about the response, about everything. I'm not delusional. I'm not broken in the ways you think I am. Sarajevo taught me that ignoring warnings gets people killed. And I won't let that happen again. Not while I'm still breathing. That can be arranged, Fisher said, gesturing to her operatives. The moment stretched thin, balanced on the edge of violence. Then, from the darkness beyond the floodlights, came the sounds Irene had been hoping for. Vehicles, many of them, converging on the warehouse. Austrian security, responding to Adler's coordination faster than Fisher had anticipated. Fisher's expression shifted from confident to calculating. She could fight, could trigger Requiem early as a desperate final act, or she could recognize that her operation had been compromised beyond recovery. The conductor studied Irene for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the person she dismissed as a broken agent who'd somehow dismantled months of careful planning. You know what's interesting, Agent Hill, Fisher said as Austrian tactical teams surrounded the warehouse. I planned for every variable except one. That someone dismissed as incompetent might actually be competent enough to see what everyone else missed. That's my mistake. I won't make it again. You won't get the chance, Irene replied as armed officers moved in to secure the area. As Fisher and her operatives were taken into custody, as the warehouse full of explosive equipment was secured and documented, Irene finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that had been building for days. She'd been right. She'd proven it. And for the first time since Sarajevo, being right felt like vindication rather than hollow victory. Adler appeared through the confusion, his expression combining relief and respect. The summit gala is being postponed, pending complete security review. Austrian authorities are apologizing for not taking your evidence seriously sooner. And Brussels is very carefully not commenting on anything at all. Typical, Irene said, managing a tired smile. There's more. Director Kovac is requesting immediate communication with you. Apparently, he's very interested in discussing your reinstatement and the possibility of heading a new threat assessment division that values field experience over algorithmic models. Irene looked at the warehouse, at the catastrophe that had been prevented, at the evidence that had finally forced people to listen. Tell Kovac, I'll consider it. After I get some sleep and have a very long conversation with Weber about the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. The morning after Fisher's arrest, Vienna woke to news reports of a thwarted terrorist attack on the G7 summit. Official statements praised the coordination between European intelligence agencies, carefully omitting the fact that one dismissed agent had been responsible for uncovering the entire conspiracy. Irene watched the press conference from Adler's office, noting how smoothly the narrative had been constructed to avoid embarrassing questions about why the threat hadn't been identified through normal channels. They're protecting themselves, Adler observed, bringing her coffee. Admitting that their systems failed would undermine confidence in the entire intelligence apparatus. Easier to present this as a success story of international cooperation. I don't care about credit, Irene said, though part of her bristled at the erasure of her role. I care that it was stopped. That's what matters. That's admirably principled. But you should care about credit. You've earned it, and more importantly, you've proven that the current threat assessment methodologies have serious blind spots. Adler handed her a tablet displaying several news articles. The intelligence community is already discussing this privately. Word is spreading about how a dismissed agent saw what all the algorithms missed. You've started a conversation that Brussels can't control. Irene scrolled through the articles, seeing between the lines of official statements to the underlying acknowledgement that something fundamental had failed. Fisher's arrest had yielded additional intelligence about Requiem's planning, including communications that confirmed every pattern Irene had identified. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and deeply embarrassing to people like Weber who'd dismissed it all as paranoid delusion. Her phone rang with a Brussels number she recognized, Director Kovac. Irene let it ring twice before answering, taking small satisfaction in making him wait. Agent Hill. Kovac's voice was carefully neutral. I wanted to personally commend you on your excellent work in Vienna. Your persistence in pursuing what others might have overlooked prevented a catastrophic incident. Others didn't overlook it, Director. They actively dismissed it. There's a difference. A pause. Then Kovac continued with forced diplomacy. There have been discussions about your status and your future with the agency. We'd like to offer you reinstatement with a significant promotion. We're creating a new division focused on threat assessment that incorporates field experience and human analysis alongside our technological approaches. We'd like you to lead it. It was everything Irene had wanted before Sarajevo. Recognition, authority, resources to do the work properly. But now, sitting in Vienna with the bitter taste of vindication in her mouth, she found herself hesitating. The offer came only because she'd been proven spectacularly right, because the embarrassment of dismissing her was greater than the discomfort of acknowledging her value. I need time to consider it, she said finally. After what happened, after being dismissed and disbelieved, I need to be sure that Brussels actually values what I bring, rather than just trying to manage the optics of having been wrong. That's understandable. Take whatever time you need. But Agent Hill, I hope you'll consider that institutions can learn from mistakes. What happened to you? The dismissal of your warnings, it's prompted serious review of our procedures. Your experience could help reshape how we approach threat assessment entirely. After ending the call, Irene sat quietly, processing the conversation. Adler watched her with the patient attention of someone who understood complicated professional decisions. What are you thinking? He asked. I'm thinking about Sarajevo. About Victor Hammond dismissing my concerns because they didn't fit his comfortable certainties. About how that dismissal cost lives and broke something in me that maybe needed to be broken. Irene set down her coffee. I've spent 18 months being treated as damaged goods, as someone whose trauma made them unreliable. But my trauma made me better at seeing threats precisely because I understand what happens when you ignore them. So you'll take the position. I don't know yet. Part of me wants to return to Brussels, to build this new division, to change the systems that failed. But another part wonders if I'm just setting myself up to fight the same battles in a different form. Weber and people like him won't disappear just because I have a promotion and a mandate. True. But they also can't dismiss you anymore. You've proven your methods work. That field instinct and pattern recognition matter as much as algorithmic analysis. That's leverage you didn't have before. Irene considered this, recognizing the truth in Adler's words. She'd spent months being powerless, watched by people who'd written her off as broken and unreliable. Now she had power, had proven competence that couldn't be easily dismissed. The question was how to use that power without becoming another bureaucrat more concerned with protecting institutional authority than with doing the actual work. Heinrich, can I ask you something? When Luca first contacted you about me, when he told you about a dismissed agent chasing conspiracy theories in Vienna, did you believe him? Or did you think I was delusional? Adler was quiet for a moment, then answered with characteristic honesty. I thought you were probably seeing patterns that weren't there, that trauma had made you hypervigilant to the point of paranoia. But I also thought that dismissing you completely was dangerous, that even paranoid warnings sometimes contain truth. So I gave you a chance to prove yourself. And you did. That's more than Brussels gave me. Yes. And that's why you should go back and build something better. Not for recognition or vindication, but because you understand what it's like to be dismissed when you're right. You can create systems that don't make that same mistake. It was a compelling argument, one that appealed to Irene's sense of purpose. She'd survived Sarajevo, survived dismissal, survived Vienna. Perhaps the point of all that survival was to ensure others wouldn't have to fight the same battles she'd fought. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But first, I need to have a very direct conversation with Dr. Weber about the dangers of algorithmic certainty and the value of field experience." "That conversation is long overdue." Adler smiled. "I'd pay to watch that. Stick around Brussels long enough, and you might get the chance." Irene stood, feeling steadier than she had in months. "Thank you, Heinrich, for listening when no one else would. For giving me the chance to prove I wasn't broken in the ways they thought I was." "You're welcome. Though I suspect you would have found a way to stop Requiem regardless of my help. You're remarkably stubborn when you think you're right." "That's not stubbornness. That's dedication to keeping people alive." Irene gathered her things, preparing to return to Brussels and whatever came next. "There's a difference." As she left Adler's office, Vienna stretched out below, peaceful and secure because someone dismissed as broken had refused to accept that dismissal. The city would never know how close it had come to catastrophe, would never know that their safety had depended on a traumatized agent who saw threats more clearly precisely because she understood what happened when you ignored them. Sometimes being broken was the only way to see what everyone else missed. Irene had learned that lesson in Sarajevo, had proven it in Vienna. Now it was time to teach it to Brussels, whether they wanted to learn or not. 3 weeks later, Irene stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been relegated to the back row and dismissed as paranoid. But everything had changed. The room was filled with senior officials from multiple European intelligence agencies, all gathered to hear about the new Integrated Threat Assessment Division and the methodology that had identified Requiem when all traditional systems had failed. Director Kovac introduced her with carefully crafted words that acknowledged her success without dwelling too much on the agency's failure to listen. Dr. Weber sat in the front row, his expression carefully neutral, the comfortable certainty that had once defined him now tempered by the undeniable evidence that his methodologies had nearly missed a catastrophic attack. "Thank you, Director," Irene began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here to discuss how we rebuild threat assessment to incorporate both technological analysis and human expertise, both algorithmic pattern recognition and field instinct. Because the truth that Vienna taught us is that neither approach alone is sufficient." She pulled up a presentation showing the Requiem network, how it had been structured specifically to avoid triggering algorithmic alerts while still leaving patterns visible to someone with field experience. Dr. Fisher understood our systems perfectly. She knew what the algorithms looked for and designed her operation to exploit those blind spots. She succeeded because we'd become over-reliant on technological certainty at the expense of human judgment. Weber shifted uncomfortably but didn't interrupt. Around the room, other officials leaned forward, recognizing the implications for their own operations. "I'm not suggesting we abandon analytical frameworks," Irene continued. "I'm suggesting we recognize their limitations and build complementary systems that value the kind of pattern recognition that comes from field experience. Systems that don't automatically dismiss warnings just because they don't fit comfortable models or come from people we've labeled as unreliable." She pulled up her next slide, showing the communication she'd flagged weeks before Vienna. These intercepts were available to everyone. They were in our databases, processed through our systems, and determined to be non-threatening. But to someone who'd worked these networks, who understood how they communicated and what their coded language actually meant, the threat was obvious. The question is why we created a system that valued algorithmic analysis over that kind of expertise. Deputy Director Volkov spoke from her seat near the front. "Agent Hill, are you suggesting that personal judgment should override analytical frameworks? Because that sounds like a recipe for chaos and individual bias." "No, Deputy Director." I'm suggesting that when personal judgment and analytical frameworks disagree, we investigate further rather than automatically dismissing one or the other. I'm suggesting that trauma and field experience don't make someone unreliable. They often make them better at recognizing threats precisely because they understand consequences. Irene met Volkov's gaze steadily. And I'm suggesting that calling someone paranoid is easier than acknowledging that our comfortable systems might have serious flaws. The room was silent for a moment. Then, surprisingly, it was Weber who spoke. Agent Hill is correct. The Requiem case exposed significant limitations in our current methodologies. We've been conducting extensive reviews, and the patterns she identified were present in our data. We simply weren't looking for them in the right way. He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the admission. Her approach, while unconventional, proved more effective than our established protocols. That's a lesson we need to learn from. It was as close to an apology as Weber would ever offer, but it was something. Acknowledgement that the dismissed agent had been right while the comfortable experts had been dangerously wrong. Irene spent the next hour presenting her vision for the new division. Integrated teams that combined analysts with field operatives, systems that flagged unusual patterns for human review rather than automatically filtering them out. Protocols that encouraged questioning assumptions rather than defaulting to algorithmic certainty. It was ambitious, would require significant resources and cultural change, but the Vienna case had created momentum that made ambitious ideas suddenly possible. After the presentation, as officials filed out discussing implications and implementations, Luca approached with a genuine smile. "You did it. You actually changed things. Maybe. We'll see if the changes stick, or if everyone reverts to comfortable certainty once the embarrassment of Vienna fades." Irene gathered her materials. But at least now there's a framework for agents who see things others miss. A system that won't automatically dismiss them as broken. Speaking of which, how are you? Really? It was the question Irene had been asking herself for weeks. How was she, after everything that had happened? After being proven right, in ways that vindicated her methods, but couldn't erase the trauma that had shaped them. "I'm still broken in some ways," she admitted. "Sarajevo didn't go away just because Vienna worked out. I still see threats everywhere, still question everything, still carry scars that therapy hasn't completely healed. But I've learned that being broken doesn't mean being wrong. Sometimes it means being the only person who can see clearly." Luca nodded, understanding in a way that few others could. "The new division is lucky to have you leading it. The new division is lucky we learned from Vienna before the next catastrophe. There will be others, Luca. Other fishers who understand our systems and structure operations to exploit them. The question is whether we build something flexible enough to catch them." As she left the building that evening, walking through Brussels streets that glowed in the twilight, Irene thought about the journey from that morning briefing weeks ago to this moment. She'd been dismissed, investigated alone, nearly killed, and ultimately vindicated. But more than vindication, she'd proven something important. That the qualities others saw as weaknesses, her hypervigilance, her refusal to accept comfortable certainties, her trauma-sharpened instincts, could be strengths when properly channeled. Her phone buzzed with a message from Heinrich Adler. "Congratulations on the new position. Vienna sends its thanks, even if officially we're pretending you were never here. If you need an ally for the hard fights ahead, you know where to find me." Irene smiled and pocketed her phone. The hard fights were coming, she knew. Institutional resistance to change. People like Weber who'd agree to reforms in principle while resisting them in practice. New threats that would test whether the lessons of Vienna had actually been learned. But she'd faced worse odds and survived. Had been broken and put herself back together into something stronger, if not exactly whole. The evening air was cool and clear, and somewhere in the city, people were going about their lives unaware of how close catastrophe had come, unaware that their safety had depended on a dismissed agent who'd refused to accept dismissal, who'd proven that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. Irene Hill walked toward her future, carrying her scars and her victories in equal measure, ready for whatever came next. Because she'd learned in Sarajevo and proven in Vienna that the most dangerous thing wasn't being broken. It was giving up, accepting limitations, letting others define what you could see and what you were allowed to believe. She'd never make that mistake again. And now, leading the division that bore her imprint, she'd make sure others didn't either. The threats would keep coming, as they always did. But this time, there would be people ready to see them, trained to trust their instincts, empowered to speak up even when comfortable certainties suggested otherwise. That was her legacy from Vienna. Not vindication or recognition, but the creation of systems that valued what she'd had to fight so hard to prove. That sometimes the broken ones see most clearly, and that dismissing them is the most dangerous mistake of all. The future stretched ahead, full of challenges and possibilities. Irene was ready for both. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.